She was having tea alone until the Duke's sister murmured, "Pretend you're my brother's fiancée." The gardens of Willowmere Estate bloomed with late spring splendor, their manicured lawns dotted with ladies in pastel silks and gentlemen in dark tailcoats, all gathered for the season's most anticipated garden party. Chinese lanterns swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, casting dappled shadows across white-clothed tables laden with champagne flutes and delicate finger sandwiches, while a string quartet played Mozart from beneath a rose-covered pergola. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're listening from. Let's begin. Georgia Klein had positioned herself in the most inconspicuous corner of the stone terrace, partially concealed by a marble statue of Venus, her teacup balanced on the balustrade beside her. At 24, she had perfected the art of appearing pleasantly engaged while remaining utterly unnoticed, a necessary skill for a woman whose modest inheritance barely stretched to cover her ailing aunt's mounting medical expenses and their modest lodgings in an unfashionable quarter of town. Not that she was unattractive. Quite the opposite. Her chestnut hair caught glints of amber in the sunlight, and her hazel eyes held an intelligence that had once attracted attention during her abbreviated first season 6 years ago. But after her father's merchant business had collapsed spectacularly, taking her dowry with it, and her fiancé had promptly dissolved their engagement, Georgia had learned to make herself small, to observe rather than participate, to exist on society's margins without drawing the scrutiny that came with either ambition or scandal. She sipped her cooling Darjeeling and allowed herself a quiet exhale of contentment. This was manageable, fulfilling her social obligations, contributing her nominal subscription to the charitable cause, and avoiding the pitying glances that inevitably accompanied questions about her marital prospects or her family's unfortunate circumstances. That tranquility shattered spectacularly when a rustle of lavender silk announced an arrival beside her, and a cultured voice, breathless, urgent, and utterly unexpected, spoke directly into her ear. "Miss Klein, I realize we've never been properly introduced, but I'm desperate, and you're the answer to a prayer I didn't know I was praying." Georgia turned to find herself face to face with Lady Natalie Bartley, sister to the Duke of Thornwick, one of England's most eligible and notoriously reclusive peers. Natalie was perhaps 30, strikingly beautiful in an unconventional way, with sharp cheekbones, penetrating blue eyes, and an expression that currently broadcast something Georgia had never associated with the aristocracy: genuine desperation. "Lady Natalie," Georgia managed, setting down her cup before she dropped it. "I'm honored by your attention, but I'm afraid I don't understand." "My brother is being blackmailed," Natalie interrupted, her voice low but fierce, her fingers gripping Georgia's wrist with surprising strength. "That woman," she angled her head subtly toward the lawn where a statuesque beauty in emerald green held court among a circle of admirers, "Lady Cordelia Ashton. She's threatening to ruin Geoffrey with lies about a compromising situation that never happened. She's cornered him by the rose garden, making her demands, marriage or a fortune, or she'll spread her poison throughout London." George's gaze followed Natalie's indication to where a tall, dark-haired gentleman stood rigid as a statue near the garden's edge, his jaw set, his eyes cold as a widow in elaborate emerald silk whispered intimately into his ear. Even from this distance, Georgia could see the Duke's barely contained fury, the dangerous stillness of a man trapped by circumstance rather than choice. "I don't see how I could possibly," Georgia began. "If he's already engaged," Natalie said urgently, her blue eyes boring into Georgia's with desperate intensity, "she has no leverage. The scandal she's threatening loses all its power if he's already spoken for, if his affections are already claimed. Do you understand?" Georgia's heart began to hammer. "You cannot possibly be suggesting." "Just for today," Natalie pressed, already drawing her to her feet with remarkable determination. "Just one afternoon. appear as his fiancée, deflect that viper's schemes, and I swear on my family's honor, I will compensate you generously. Enough to cover your aunt's medical care for a year. Enough to live without constant financial anxiety. Please, Miss Klein. My brother is too proud to ask for help, too honorable to pay blackmail, and too isolated to see the trap closing around him. But you could save him. Every rational instinct screamed at Georgia to refuse, to extract herself from this madness immediately. She thought of her aunt's worried face when the apothecary's bills arrived, of the threadbare carpets in their tiny parlor, of the weight of constant economizing that pressed on her shoulders like physical burden. She thought of the Duke's trapped expression, of a man being cornered by a predator in silk and jewels. What would I need to do? She heard herself ask. Natalie's expression transformed into something between relief and triumph. Simply stand beside him, allow me to introduce you as his intended, and look at him as though he's remotely tolerable. Can you manage that? Before Georgia could answer, before she could fully process the insanity of what she was agreeing to, Natalie was already steering her down the terrace steps, through clusters of gossiping guests, across the immaculate lawn toward where the Duke of Thornwick stood like a condemned man awaiting execution. Lady Cordelia's crimson lips curved in a smile that promised nothing but destruction. Chapter 1. Natalie's grip on George's arm was surprisingly strong for someone who looked as though she'd never done anything more strenuous than lift a teacup. They wove through clusters of guests, Natalie's smile never faltering even as her fingernails dug crescents into George's wrist. Smile, Natalie murmured through her own brilliant expression. You're about to meet the love of your life. George's stomach lurched. This was madness. Complete, utter madness. Yet she found herself straightening her shoulders, lifting her chin, adopting the pleasant expression she'd perfected over years of pretending everything was perfectly fine while her world crumbled around her. The Duke of Thornwick was taller than she'd realized from a distance, perhaps 6 feet, with dark hair that fell across his forehead despite obvious attempts to tame it. His eyes, gray-green and currently ice-cold, flickered from Lady Cordelia to his approaching sister with something that might have been relief or might have been resignation. It was difficult to tell with a man who held himself with such rigid control. Lady Cordelia's gaze landed on Georgia like a blade. The widow was perhaps 35, beautiful in the way poisonous flowers are beautiful, with auburn hair, cat-like amber eyes, and a figure that her emerald gown displayed to calculated advantage. Her smile could have cut glass. "Geoffrey, darling," Natalie sang out with perfect aristocratic cheer. "I've been searching everywhere for you. And you must forgive me, Lady Cordelia, for stealing him away, but his fiancée has been asking for him." The word landed like a stone in still water. Ripples of shock spread across 3 faces simultaneously. His what? Lady Cordelia's voice could have frozen wine. Fiancé. The Duke's expression was a masterpiece of controlled confusion, but Georgia caught something else in his eyes. Sharp intelligence rapidly assessing the situation and reaching the correct conclusion. "Miss Georgia Klein," Natalie continued, her hand now at Georgia's back, propelling her forward with inexorable force. "Geoffrey's intended. They've been keeping their understanding private. Haven't you, you secretive creatures?" Georgia found herself standing directly beside the Duke, close enough to catch the scent of sandalwood and something crisp like winter air. She forced herself to meet his gaze and was startled by what she saw there. Not anger, but a question. A choice being offered. He was giving her an escape route, she realized. One word from her, and he would handle this differently. But then she thought of Aunt Beatrice's labored breathing, of the apothecary's increasingly impatient demands for payment, of the way her aunt tried to hide her pain to spare Georgia worry. She thought of Natalie's promise of compensation, of 1 year without the crushing weight of constant financial anxiety. "Your Grace," Georgia said softly, and dropped into a curtsy that somehow conveyed both respect and intimacy. "I hope I haven't kept you waiting too long." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation for a performance well delivered. Not at all, Miss Klein. His voice was deeper than she'd expected. Cultured but with an edge of steel beneath the courtesy. Though I admit I'm surprised my sister chose this particular moment for introductions. Well, Lady Cordelia was just telling me how concerned she is about your unmarried state, Natalie said brightly, her eyes gleaming with something fierce and protective. I thought it best to put her mind at ease immediately. Lady Cordelia's expression had progressed from shock to fury, though she maintained a veneer of civility. How extraordinary! I've heard no whispers of an engagement. We prefer discretion, the Duke said, and Georgia felt his hand settle at the small of her back, warm, solid, and utterly unexpected. The gesture appeared possessive to any observer, but she could feel the tension in his touch, the careful question in it. Though I suppose the secret is rather thoroughly out now. Indeed. Lady Cordelia's smile was all teeth. How very convenient. And when did this understanding occur? Does it matter? The Duke's voice had gone silky with warning. The situation is as it is, Lady Cordelia. I'm afraid whatever conversation we were having has become rather moot. For a moment, Georgia thought the widow might actually bare her teeth. Instead, she stepped closer. Her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for their ears. This isn't over, Geoffrey. You cannot simply produce a fiancé like a rabbit from a hat and expect your problems to disappear. Watch me, he replied with devastating calm. Lady Cordelia's gaze swept over Georgia with such contempt that she felt her cheeks flush. Enjoy your little performance, Miss Klein. I wonder how long you'll last once society begins asking questions. Then she swept away in a rustle of emerald silk and barely concealed rage, leaving Georgia standing beside a duke she'd never met, pretending to be in love, with no idea how this lie would unravel, only the certainty that it would, and that she would likely be ruined in the aftermath. Well, the Duke said quietly, his hand still at her back, that was unexpectedly dramatic. Perhaps we should discuss what precisely I've just agreed to. Georgia met his gaze and found, surprisingly, a hint of dark humor lurking behind the aristocratic reserve. I believe, Your Grace, we should discuss what we've both agreed to. His lips twitched. Geoffrey, please. If we're engaged, formality seems redundant. Georgia, she replied, and despite everything, the madness, the risk, the absolute insanity of what she'd just done, she found herself almost smiling. Well then, Georgia, he said, offering his arm with perfect propriety. Shall we take a turn about the garden and determine exactly how deeply my sister has entangled us both? She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fine wool of his coat, and allowed herself to be led away from the whispered conversations already spreading like wildfire through the garden party, away from Lady Cordelia's venomous glare, away from everything safe and sensible she'd ever known, and toward something that felt terrifyingly like possibility. Chapter 2. Bartley House was exactly the sort of establishment Georgia had spent years avoiding. All soaring ceilings, gleaming marble, and the casual opulence that announced wealth so old it no longer needed announcing. The butler who admitted her barely concealed his skepticism as he led her through corridors lined with ancestral portraits, each gilded frame worth more than everything Georgia owned. Geoffrey received her in his study, a surprisingly comfortable room despite its grandeur, all dark wood and leather-bound books that actually looked read rather than decorative. He stood by the window, silhouetted against the morning light, and didn't turn when she entered. My sister has a habit of meddling, he said without preamble, his voice cool as January frost. Usually I'm better at preventing her schemes before they detonate in public. Your Grace. Geoffrey. He turned then, and Georgia was struck again by how his formal demeanor contrasted with something warmer in his eyes. If we're to maintain this fiction, we might as well be honest with each other in private. Very well. Geoffrey. Georgia straightened her spine. Then let me be direct. I agreed to your sister's proposition because I need money. My aunt requires medical care I can barely afford, and Lady Natalie offered compensation generous enough to matter. I have no romantic illusions about this arrangement, no designs on your title, and no intention of extending this charade beyond what's necessary to solve your immediate problem." For the first time since she'd entered, Geoffrey's expression shifted. Surprise, then something that might have been respect. He moved to the desk, gestured for her to sit, and settled into the chair opposite with less aristocratic stiffness. "Thank God," he said with startling frankness. "Honesty is refreshing. I've spent the last decade fending off women who mistake my title for my personality, who see a duke rather than a man. Fortune hunters, ambitious mamas, debutantes who practice looking enchanted in mirrors." His mouth twisted. "Lady Cordelia is simply more dangerous than most." "What did she claim happened?" Georgia asked, then caught herself. "I apologize, that's intrusive." "No, you deserve to know what you've walked into." Geoffrey leaned back, shadows crossing his face. "She arranged to be accidentally discovered in my private library at Lord Morrison's ball last month. Her dress conveniently torn, claiming I'd made improper advances. Complete fabrication, but she had witnesses positioned perfectly. Marriage or payment to ensure her silence, those were my options. Until I appeared as convenient salvation." "Precisely." His gaze sharpened. "You mentioned needing money. May I ask?" "My father's merchant business collapsed 5 years ago," Georgia said, meeting his eyes steadily. "My fiancée ended our engagement 3 days later. I've been managing on a modest inheritance since, but it's running out faster than my aunt's health is improving." Something flickered in Geoffrey's expression. Recognition, perhaps, of shared wounds. People who value you only for what you provide rather than who you are. Exactly. The door burst open before either could continue. Natalie swept in like a purple-clad whirlwind, practically vibrating with excitement. "I knew you two would suit. Geoffrey, isn't she perfect? Georgia, has he been tolerable? I told him to be charming. Natalie." Geoffrey's voice carried the weight of years of sibling exasperation. "We're negotiating terms. Could you possibly contain your enthusiasm for 5 consecutive minutes?" "Terms?" Natalie pouted. "How unromantic." "It's a business arrangement," Georgia said firmly. "Romance was never part of the agreement." "Yet," Natalie murmured, earning a quelling glare from her brother. Over the next hour they established parameters with surprising efficiency. 2 months. Enough time for Lady Cordelia to abandon her schemes and find another target. Staged courtship with carefully planned public appearances. Financial compensation paid in installments to ensure cooperation from all parties. Weekly visits to maintain the illusion. Clear boundaries about physical contact. Hand-holding acceptable. Anything more required explicit permission. "One more thing," Geoffrey said as Georgia prepared to leave. "We should actually get to know each other. The lie works better with truth underneath. Shared interests, genuine conversation. If we're strangers playing roles, people will notice." "You want us to become friends?" Georgia couldn't quite hide her surprise. "I want us to become convincing." But his slight smile suggested something more. "Besides, if I'm to spend 2 months pretending to court you, I'd prefer to actually enjoy the company." How pragmatic. "I prefer honest." He stood, offering his hand. "Agreed." Georgia placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his grip, the unexpected steadiness. "Agreed." "Excellent," Natalie chirped from her position by the door, where she'd clearly been eavesdropping. "I've already planned your first outing. The park, Thursday afternoon, very public." "Natalie," Geoffrey and Georgia said simultaneously. then caught each other's eyes and shared a look of perfect understanding. It was, Georgia realized with some alarm, the first time in 5 years she'd felt genuinely understood by anyone. "This is going to be complicated," she murmured. Jeffrey's smile was wry. "Miss Klein, I suspect that's the understatement of the season." Chapter 3. Their first public outing was a masterclass in awkwardness. Hyde Park glittered with afternoon society, and Georgia felt every eye upon them as Jeffrey offered his arm with stiff formality. They walked like marionettes being operated by different puppeteers. His stride too long, her steps too quick, both hyper-aware of the spectacle they were creating. "You're holding your shoulders like you expect an attack," Jeffrey murmured, nodding pleasantly to a passing couple. "I'm being attacked. By stares. And whispers." Georgia forced a smile that felt more like baring teeth. "Did you hear Lady Pemberton? Sudden good fortune indeed. They think I've trapped you. Let them think it. Lady Cordelia's the one who matters." But his jaw tightened as another cluster of ladies erupted into barely concealed speculation. As if summoned by her name, Lady Cordelia materialized near the Serpentine, resplendent in crimson silk that matched her vindictive smile. "Your Grace, Miss Klein. How delightful to see you both." Her tone could have curdled milk. "Though I must say, such a hasty engagement does invite questions. One wonders what prompted such urgency." Georgia felt Jeffrey stiffen beside her, but before he could respond, she found her voice. "Affection requires no particular timeline, Lady Cordelia. Surely you understand that some things are simply meant to be." How romantic. Cordelia's eyes glittered with malice. "Though I've always found that sudden arrangements often conceal desperate circumstances. For one party or the other. Are you suggesting something specific?" Jeffrey's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Because if so, I'd prefer directness to insinuation." The widow's smile widened. "Simply offering friendly observation, Your Grace. After all, reputations are such fragile things. One never knows when inconvenient truths might surface." She glided away, leaving a chill in the warm afternoon air. Jeffrey's hand covered Georgia's where it rested on his arm, a gesture meant to appear affectionate, but she felt the protective tension in it. "I apologize. She's more venomous than I anticipated." "I can handle venom," Georgia said, surprised to find it true. "I've survived worse than malicious gossip." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of unexpected strength. The tea at Georgia's lodgings 3 days later was a study in contrasts. Jeffrey seemed too large for her tiny parlor, too elegant for the worn furniture and faded wallpaper. Yet when Aunt Beatrice shuffled in, struggling with her breathing, his courtesy never faltered. "Mrs. Hartley, I'm honored to meet you." He took her fragile hand with perfect gentleness. "Georgia speaks of you with such devotion." "Does she now?" Aunt Beatrice's shrewd blue eyes assessed him thoroughly while Georgia arranged the tea service with trembling hands, hyper-aware of the chipped cup and mismatched saucers. "And what brings a duke to our humble establishment?" "Your niece's company," Jeffrey said simply, "which I find considerably more interesting than most of society's offerings." Aunt Beatrice's eyebrows rose, and throughout the tea, Georgia caught her aunt watching them with unsettling perception, particularly when Jeffrey laughed at one of Georgia's dry observations about the absurdity of social conventions, his reserve cracking to reveal genuine amusement. Later, after Jeffrey had left, Aunt Beatrice patted Georgia's hand. "That's not pretend affection, dear. It's an arrangement. Nothing more." Her aunt's knowing look suggested she wasn't remotely convinced. The theater that evening should have been tedious. Natalie had chosen a melodrama so overwrought that even the actors seemed embarrassed. But Georgia found herself laughing helplessly during the second act when the heroine fainted for the 4th time, and Jeffrey leaned close to whisper, I believe she's attempting to set a record. Shall we wager on whether she manages a fifth? That's terrible, Georgia hissed back, trying to muffle her giggles. But accurate. His eyes gleamed with humor in the dim light. During intermission, they discussed everything from the absurdity of the play to philosophical questions about art's purpose, and Georgia realized with alarm how easy it was to talk to him, how naturally their conversation flowed when stripped of performative pretense. In the carriage ride home, Natalie dozed in the corner. Her chaperoning had apparently exhausted her, leaving Georgia and Jeffrey in comfortable silence. The darkness felt intimate, protective. When the carriage jolted over a rough patch, Jeffrey's hand shot out to steady her, landing over her fingers on the seat between them. He didn't immediately withdraw. Neither did she. Warning bells clanged in Georgia's mind. This was supposed to be business, a transaction with clear boundaries and defined endpoints. Yet sitting in the darkness with Jeffrey's warm hand covering hers, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the ease of simply existing beside him, it felt dangerously like something real. Georgia, he said quietly. Don't. She pulled her hand away gently but firmly. Whatever you're about to say, don't. We have an agreement. 2 months. Clear terms. I know. But his voice carried a weight that suggested he was as unmoored as she felt. I know. The carriage stopped outside her lodgings, and Georgia fled into the night with her heart hammering and the terrible knowledge that pretending was becoming far too easy, too natural, and entirely too dangerous. Chapter 4. The gallery at Bartley House was a revelation. Not the formal collection displayed for guests, but Jeffrey's private sanctuary, a long room flooded with northern light where paintings leaned against walls in comfortable disorder, as if he'd been having conversations with them. I didn't expect you to collect modern works, Georgia said, stopping before a Turner seascape that seemed to dissolve into light and color. Most of your peers prefer something more conventional. Most of my peers prefer things that announce their wealth rather than challenge their thinking. Jeffrey stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. Beauty should disturb us, don't you think? Make us see differently. Or help us see what we've been hiding from. She turned to find him watching her rather than the painting. Is that what you do here? Hide. Perhaps. His smile was self-deprecating. Everyone wants the Duke, the title, the wealth, the connections. No one particularly wants Jeffrey, the man who reads philosophy until 3 a.m. and thinks most social rituals are elaborate theater designed to prevent genuine human connection. The raw honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Georgia moved to another painting, a portrait of a young woman, half her face in shadow. Everyone saw my dowry when I was 18. No one saw me. The girl who preferred books to balls, who asked too many questions, who wanted conversations instead of compliments about her eyes. She laughed without humor. When the money vanished, so did everyone's interest. Apparently, I was only worth knowing when I came with £5,000 attached. Their loss. Jeffrey's voice was quiet but fierce. And their blindness. She turned to meet his gaze, finding something raw and unguarded there. For a moment, the air between them felt charged with recognition. Two people who'd learned to armor themselves against a world that valued surfaces over substance, suddenly seeing past each other's defenses. The moment shattered when a footman entered with a message. Jeffrey's jaw tightened as he read. Lady Cordelia has been busy. According to this, she's now suggesting to anyone who'll listen that our engagement is a business arrangement to cover some unspecified scandal. She's not entirely wrong, Georgia said, trying for levity. No, but she's making it sound sordid rather than practical. He crumpled the note. I apologize for dragging you into this mess. I walked in willingly. For money, remember. But the words felt hollow now, a script from a play that no longer fit. By their next scheduled outing, A musicale at Lady Pemberton's. Lady Cordelia's poison had spread like infection through society. Georgia felt the whispers following them, saw the speculative glances, the barely concealed judgment. Geoffrey's hand at her back felt less like performance and more like lifeline. Then Geoffrey sent word canceling their appearance at the Thornbury ball. Indisposed was all the note said, but Natalie appeared at Georgia's lodgings the next morning, her usual exuberance replaced by worry. He's ill. Refusing to see the physician, insisting he'll be fine by tomorrow for your scheduled ride in the park. Natalie wrung her hands. But he's feverish and stubborn, and he won't listen to me. Georgia should have maintained proper distance. Should have sent concerned wishes and stayed away. Instead, she found herself in Geoffrey's bedchamber an hour later, Natalie having cleared the way with conspiratorial efficiency. He looked terrible, pale beneath the fever flush, dark circles shadowing his eyes, his hair disheveled in a way that made him seem younger, more vulnerable. When he saw her, confusion flickered across his face. Georgia, you shouldn't. Hush. She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, ignoring how improper this was. You're ill. Stop being noble about it. He laughed, which turned into coughing. Always practical. Over the next hours, she tended him with an efficiency that surprised them both. Cool compresses, persuading him to drink willow bark tea, reading aloud when he grew restless. The fever climbed as afternoon faded to evening, and his careful control crumbled. Don't leave, he mumbled, fingers catching her wrist with surprising strength. Everyone leaves. Mother died, father retreated into grief, even Natalie went away to school. Everyone sees the Duke, takes what they need, then leaves. Don't. I'm here, Georgia whispered, her heart cracking open. I'm not going anywhere. Promise. His eyes, bright with fever, locked on hers with desperate intensity. Promise you won't be like the others. She couldn't make that promise. Shouldn't make it. Their arrangement had an expiration date, clear terms, defined boundaries. But sitting there with his hand gripping hers, seeing past the aristocratic armor to the lonely man beneath, Georgia realized with devastating clarity that her feelings had stopped being pretend weeks ago. She was falling in love with him. And that was the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. Chapter 5. The garden party at Bartley House marked their 4th week together, and Georgia realized with some alarm how natural it had become. This borrowed life of silk gowns and champagne, of Geoffrey's hand at her waist guiding her through crowds, of belonging somewhere for the first time in 5 years. Natalie had outdone herself with the arrangements, from the rose arbors dripping with white blooms to the string quartet playing Vivaldi. But her true masterpiece was the seating chart that kept positioning Georgia and Geoffrey together at every turn. Your sister has all the subtlety of a cavalry charge, Georgia murmured as Natalie not so accidentally directed them toward the secluded bench by the lily pond. She means well. Geoffrey's lips twitched. She's simply convinced that her meddling is actually destiny working through her as an instrument. How humble of destiny. His laugh was genuine, unguarded, and Georgia felt the dangerous warmth spreading through her chest. The same warmth that had been growing since she'd sat by his sickbed, since she'd seen past the Duke to the man beneath. Lady Cordelia's arrival shattered the moment like a stone through glass. She swept across the lawn with predatory grace, her voice pitched to carry across the garden. Miss Klein, how lovely you look. Though I confess, I'm still puzzling over this whirlwind romance. Tell me, what exactly attracted you to the Duke? His conversation. His character. Her smile was poisonous. Or perhaps his annual income of £40,000. The nearby conversations stuttered to silence. Georgia felt blood rush to her face, but before she could formulate a response, Geoffrey was on his feet, placing himself between her and Cordelia with controlled fury. Lady Cordelia. His voice could have frozen fire. I'll ask you to retract that insinuation immediately. I'm simply asking what everyone is wondering, Your Grace. The circumstances are rather convenient, wouldn't you say? What's convenient, Geoffrey said, his voice ringing across the suddenly silent garden, is that I found someone who sees past title and fortune to the man beneath. Someone whose intelligence challenges me, whose honesty humbles me, whose presence makes me want to be better than I am. He turned to Georgia, and the intensity in his eyes stole her breath. Georgia has given me something I'd stopped believing existed. Genuine connection with someone who wants nothing from me except my company. If you call that convenient, I call it miraculous. The words hung in the air, too raw, too honest, too real. Georgia's heart hammered against her ribs. This was performance, she reminded herself desperately. Improvisation to counter Cordelia's attack. But his eyes, God! His eyes looked like a man speaking truth, not acting a part. Applause rippled through the guests. Cordelia's face contorted with rage before she spun away in a rustle of taffeta. Natalie beamed. And Georgia felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Walk with me, Geoffrey said quietly, offering his arm. She let him lead her deeper into the garden, away from curious eyes, until they reached a stone fountain surrounded by jasmine. The silence between them pulsed with everything unsaid. Geoffrey. I wasn't entirely acting just then. He faced her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that terrified her. These past weeks, Georgia, I've stopped pretending. Somewhere between your aunt's parlor and my fevered confessions, this stopped being an arrangement and became. Don't. The word came out sharper than intended. We agreed this was temporary. 2 months. Clear terms. You can't just, we can't. Why not? His voice was gentle but insistent. What are we so afraid of? I'm afraid of needing someone. The admission burst from her. I'm afraid of depending on anyone, of being valued for convenience rather than choice, of building my life on someone else's foundation only to have it collapse when circumstances change. Her hands trembled. I've been abandoned before, Geoffrey. I won't survive it again. Something cracked in his expression. I see. He stepped back, putting careful distance between them. Of course. Forgive me for, I apologize. The arrangement stands as agreed. 2 months. Professional distance. Geoffrey. It's fine, Georgia. But his voice carried the weight of something breaking. I respect your boundaries. I'll maintain mine. He walked away, shoulders rigid with forced composure, leaving her alone by the jasmine fountain with her safety intact and her heart in pieces. You're both idiots. Natalie appeared from behind a hedge, arms crossed. Refusing what you obviously want because you're terrified of wanting it. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You're afraid of being hurt, so you're hurting yourself preemptively. Natalie's expression softened. But Georgia dear, safety isn't the same as happiness. And sometimes the greatest risk is never risking anything at all. That night, lying sleepless in her modest bed, Georgia stared at the ceiling and warred with herself. Independence versus connection. Safety versus possibility. The life she'd carefully constructed versus the life she might have if she were brave enough to reach for it. By dawn, she'd made no decision except that she was utterly, completely, terrifyingly in love with a man she'd promised to leave in 4 weeks' time. Chapter 6. 6 weeks into their arrangement, London society had stopped questioning their engagement and started planning wedding dates. Georgia found herself receiving invitations addressed to the future Duchess of Thornwick, a title that made her stomach twist with equal parts longing and dread. Their weekly dinners had evolved into something neither had anticipated. Not performances, but genuine conversations that stretched late into the evening. Tonight, Geoffrey had dismissed the servants after dessert, leaving them alone in the candlelit dining room with port and honesty. The tenant cottages on the northern estate are in appalling condition, he said, spreading architectural drawings across the table. I've been working with an engineer on improvements. Proper heating, sanitation, structural repairs. But the costs are substantial, and my steward thinks I'm mad for prioritizing tenants over profit margins. Georgia studied the plans, her mind already calculating. What if you staggered the improvements? Start with the most urgent repairs, demonstrate the impact on tenant health and productivity. Once the other landowners see the benefits, they might follow suit. She traced a line on the drawing. And here, if you consolidate these supply orders with neighboring estates, you could reduce costs significantly. Jeffrey stared at her. That's brilliant. Why didn't I think of that? Because you're too close to it. Sometimes an outside perspective helps. She smiled. Besides, I helped my father with his business ledgers before everything collapsed. I understand numbers. You understand far more than numbers. His voice had gone quiet, intense. Most women of my acquaintance would find estate management tedious. Most women of your acquaintance haven't had to manage household accounts on £20 a month. The words came out more bitter than intended. Jeffrey reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Georgia, about what I said in the garden. Don't. But she didn't pull away. We agreed to maintain distance. We agreed to a great many things that are becoming increasingly difficult to honor. He turned her hand over, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. Tell me about him. The man who left you. She should refuse. Should maintain the boundaries she'd so carefully erected. Instead, she found herself speaking. Edward Thornton. Son of a textile merchant, ambitious and charming. He courted me for 6 months, proposed with pretty words about partnership and love. 3 days after my father's business collapsed, he sent a letter ending our engagement. No explanation, no apology. Just gone. He was a fool. He was practical. I went from being an asset to a liability overnight. She finally met Jeffrey's eyes. It taught me that affection is conditional. That people stay as long as you're useful, and leave when you're not. Not everyone is Edward Thornton. Jeffrey's grip tightened. Some of us. You've been hurt too. She turned the conversation deliberately. By women who wanted the Duke, not Jeffrey. His jaw tightened. Caroline Ashford. I was 25, idealistic enough to believe someone could love me for myself. She was beautiful, charming, seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts rather than my title. He laughed without humor. Until I overheard her telling her friend that she'd suffer through my tedious philosophy. Because a duchess's coronet made it worthwhile. She said I was tolerable enough when he wasn't talking. Jeffrey. Since then, I've been pursued by a parade of women who see $40,000 a year and a prestigious title. Lady Cordelia is simply the most dangerous of them. He looked at their joined hands. Until you. You're the first woman in 7 years who's argued with me, challenged my thinking, treated me like a man rather than a prize to be won. The moment hung between them, fragile and terrifying. Then a sharp knock shattered it. Natalie entered, her face pale with urgency. Jeffrey, Georgia, we have a problem. Lady Cordelia has sent this. She held out a sealed envelope. Jeffrey read the contents, his expression darkening with each line. She's threatening to produce forged letters allegedly from Georgia, suggesting our engagement is a business arrangement to cover some unspecified scandal on my part. She'll distribute them throughout London unless I pay her £5,000 by week's end. Can she actually? She has a talent for forgery and wealthy friends willing to swear they witnessed whatever she claims. Jeffrey's voice was ice. "If these letters circulate, they'll destroy both our reputations. You'll be labeled a mercenary schemer, I'll be suspected of whatever scandal she invents, and our engagement will become proof of duplicity rather than romance. Then we pay her." Georgia stood, though her legs trembled. "My reputation isn't worth £5,000 of your money." "Absolutely not. I won't reward extortion." Jeffrey rose to face her. "We knew this was risky. We chose it anyway. You chose to help your sister. I chose money. Neither of us chose this." She gestured at the letter. "Let me take the blame. End the engagement, say I manipulated you, let me leave London." "No." The word was sharp, absolute. "We're in this together, Georgia. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Why?" The question burst from her. "Why protect me when ending this cleanly would solve everything?" Jeffrey crossed to her, his hands framing her face with devastating gentleness. "Because somewhere in the last 6 weeks, this stopped being about protection or arrangements or anything practical. Because when I think about you leaving, I can't breathe. Because—" Another knock interrupted. The butler entered, apologetic. "Your Grace, Lady Cordelia is here. She insists on speaking with you immediately." Jeffrey's eyes never left George's. "Tell her we'll see her together. And Natalie, stay. Whatever happens next, we face it as a united front." George's heart hammered as they walked toward the drawing room, toward confrontation, toward the moment when everything would either shatter or transform. But Jeffrey's hand was solid in hers, and for the first time in 6 years, she wasn't facing disaster alone. Chapter 7. Lady Cordelia reclined in the drawing room as though she owned it, her crimson gown a deliberate provocation against the room's tasteful blues and creams. She smiled when they entered, the expression of a cat who'd cornered particularly satisfying prey. "Your Grace. Miss Klein. How lovely that you're both here. It saves me repeating myself." She placed a leather portfolio on the table between them. "Inside are letters, very convincing letters, I assure you, detailing Miss Klein's mercenary arrangement to trap you into marriage while concealing some rather scandalous behavior on your part. Debts, perhaps. Or an inconvenient mistress. I haven't decided which scandal plays better." "Those are forgeries." Jeffrey's voice was deadly calm. "Of course they are. But they're excellent forgeries, authenticated by 3 respectable witnesses who will swear they saw Miss Klein writing them. Once distributed throughout London's drawing rooms, the truth becomes rather irrelevant, doesn't it?" Cordelia's smile widened. "Perception is everything in our world." "What do you want?" Georgia asked, though she already knew. £5,000. Delivered to my solicitor within 3 days, or these letters begin circulating at every social event, every club, every household that matters. Cordelia stood, smoothing her skirts. "After that, neither of you will be received anywhere. Miss Klein will be branded a scheming fortune hunter, and you, Your Grace, will be the fool who fell for her trap. Such a tidy scandal. Get out." Jeffrey's control was fracturing. "Now. 3 days, Your Grace. Consider it carefully." Cordelia swept toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "Oh, and attempting to expose my blackmail will only make you look more desperate. Who do you think society will believe, a respected widow or a suspiciously convenient engagement?" The silence after she left was suffocating. Georgia found her voice first. "Pay her." "Absolutely not. Jeffrey, this is my fault. I'll leave tonight. We'll say I deceived you, that you discovered my mercenary motives and ended things. Your reputation survives, I disappear quietly." "No." He rounded on her, his eyes blazing. "I won't let you be ruined for helping me. This started because Cordelia targeted me. I won't sacrifice you to save myself. But it makes sense. I have nothing to lose. You have everything to lose. His voice cracked. Your reputation, your future, any chance of, he broke off, turning away. I won't allow it. You won't allow it. Georgia's temper flared. I'm not your responsibility, Jeffrey. This was a business arrangement, remember? One that's now become inconvenient. Let me handle the consequences. It stopped being just business weeks ago, and you know it. The words hung between them, too honest, too raw. Before either could respond, Natalie's voice cut through the tension. I need to tell you both something. She stood in the doorway, her usual brightness dimmed by something that looked like guilt. Georgia, I didn't choose you randomly at that garden party. Georgia's stomach dropped. What? I'd been watching you for weeks. Researching. I knew about your father's business, your broken engagement, your aunt's illness. Natalie stepped into the room, wringing her hands. I needed someone who could help Jeffrey, yes. But I also needed someone right for him. Someone intelligent, independent, who wouldn't be intimidated by his title or his moods. Someone who'd challenge him instead of simpering. You manipulated us. Georgia's voice was flat. Both of us. I introduced you, Natalie corrected. I created an opportunity. What happened after? That was entirely you too. You researched me like a broodmare. The betrayal tasted bitter. Evaluated my qualities, decided I was suitable. I decided you were perfect for each other. Natalie's composure cracked. And I was right. Look at you. You're in love with him, he's in love with you, and you're both too stubborn and damaged to admit it. You can't force genuine feeling, Georgia said through clenched teeth. You can't orchestrate people's hearts like one of your garden parties. I didn't force anything. I just introduced you. Natalie's voice softened. Everything else, every conversation, every laugh, every moment of connection, that was real. That was yours. Was it? Georgia turned to Jeffrey, something desperate in her chest. How do we know what's real and what's performance? We started with lies, Jeffrey. We built everything on deception. Maybe what we think we feel is just us being good at pretending. Is that what you believe? His eyes searched hers. That these past 6 weeks have been performance? That every conversation, every moment He stopped, jaw tightening. If you can dismiss what we've shared as mere acting, then perhaps Cordelia's letters won't be lies at all. Perhaps we are exactly what she's claiming. 2 people using each other for convenience. The words landed like blows. That's not what I meant. Isn't it? His voice had gone cold, that ducal mask sliding back into place. You've been looking for an exit since the garden party. Cordelia's threat simply provides one with slightly more drama than planned. That's not fair. None of this is fair, Georgia. But I thought. He turned away, shoulders rigid. It doesn't matter what I thought. Natalie looked between them, stricken. I'm sorry. I was trying to help. You've helped enough. Jeffrey's voice was hollow. Both of you should leave. I need to think. Georgia wanted to argue, to explain, to somehow untangle the mess of genuine feeling and manufactured circumstance. But looking at Jeffrey's closed expression, she realized that maybe he was right. Maybe they'd been so busy playing their roles that neither of them knew where the performance ended and reality began. She left Bartley House with Natalie's apologies echoing behind her and the terrible certainty that she'd just lost something she'd never really been sure she had. Chapter 8. Georgia was packing when she heard the commotion downstairs, Aunt Beatrice's startled voice, heavy footsteps on the creaking stairs, and then Jeffrey was in her doorway, breathless and disheveled. his cravat askew and his hair wind-tossed as though he'd run the entire distance from Bartley House. "Don't go." The words came out raw, desperate. "Please, Georgia. Don't go." She stared at him, a half-folded chemise clutched in her hands. "Lady Cordelia is planning to expose everything at Lady Morrison's ball tonight. If I'm gone, if you can claim I deceived you and fled. I don't want safety without you." He crossed the tiny room in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders. "I've spent the last 12 hours in that empty house realizing I'd rather face every scandal in London with you beside me than live one more day in comfortable isolation. Geoffrey, I love you." The confession tumbled out, clumsy and honest. "Not because Natalie orchestrated our meeting, not because we've been playing roles, but because you argue with me about philosophy and challenge my assumptions and make me laugh when I least expect it. Because you're brilliant and stubborn and too proud for your own good, and when I imagine my future without you in it, everything goes gray." Tears spilled down George's cheeks. "I'm terrified of needing anyone. Of building my life around someone who might leave when things get difficult. I'm terrified of being wanted for the wrong reasons." His thumb brushed away her tears. "Of being valued for what I can provide rather than who I am. But Georgia," his voice cracked, "this feels right. Terrifying, absolutely terrifying, but right. Doesn't it?" She looked up at him, at this man who'd somehow slipped past every defense she'd constructed, and found herself nodding. "Yes. It feels right. It feels real. Then don't run. Face this with me." He pressed his forehead against hers. "Whatever Cordelia does tonight, whatever scandal erupts, we face it together. As partners. As people who love each other." She whispered. "Yes." His smile was tremulous, vulnerable. "Exactly that. She'll destroy us both. Then we'll be destroyed together. I'd rather have that than safety alone." Georgia pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Lady Morrison's ball. We go together. We go together." Lady Morrison's ballroom glittered with London's elite, unaware they were about to witness either a scandal or a spectacle. George's hand trembled on Geoffrey's arm as they entered, but his steady presence anchored her. Across the room, Lady Cordelia watched them with predatory satisfaction, the forged letters undoubtedly ready for distribution. Before Cordelia could make her move, Geoffrey guided Georgia to the center of the ballroom. The orchestra fell silent. Conversations stuttered to a halt. Every eye turned toward them. "Ladies and gentlemen," Geoffrey's voice carried across the hushed space, clear and unshakable. "I have a confession to make about my engagement to Miss Klein." George's heart hammered. Lady Cordelia's smile widened. "This engagement was arranged," Geoffrey continued, his hand tightening on George's. "My sister, in her infinite meddling wisdom, orchestrated our meeting to thwart a blackmailer who was threatening me. Miss Klein agreed to help, and yes, there was financial compensation involved." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cordelia's expression transformed into triumph. But Geoffrey wasn't finished. "What my sister orchestrated was an introduction. What happened after," he turned to Georgia, his eyes holding nothing but truth, "was entirely our choice. I fell in love with Georgia Klein not because of any arrangement, but because she's the most remarkable woman I've ever met. She challenges me, grounds me, sees me as a man rather than a title." His voice strengthened. "The engagement was arranged by my sister. But my love is entirely my own choice." He dropped to one knee before the entire assembly, pulling a ring from his pocket. Not the fake engagement ring they'd been using, but something new, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "Georgia Klein, will you marry me? Not because of blackmail or arrangements or financial necessity, but because I love you and want to spend my life with you." The ballroom held its collective breath. Georgia looked down at Jeffrey. Vulnerable, honest, offering himself without armor or pretense, and felt every last wall crumble. "Yes," she said through tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." The room erupted in applause. But Georgia only saw Jeffrey's face as he slid the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her. Thoroughly, publicly, and without a trace of performance. When she finally opened her eyes, she caught sight of Lady Cordelia's expression. The widow's triumph had curdled into shock, then fury as she realized what had happened. Jeffrey's confession had stolen her weapon. Instead of scandal, he'd created a love story. Two people overcoming obstacles to choose each other. Romantic. Defensible. Devastating to anyone who tried to tear it down. "You," Cordelia began, but Lady Morrison cut her off. "How dare you attempt blackmail against the Duke?" The hostess's voice was ice. "I believe you should leave, Lady Cordelia. Immediately." As Cordelia fled, her reputation in tatters, Georgia leaned into Jeffrey's embrace and whispered, "That was the most terrifying, reckless thing I've ever witnessed." "Did it work?" he murmured against her hair. "Perfectly." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "Absolutely perfectly." "Good," he said. "Because I wasn't acting. Not for a single moment." "Neither was I," Georgia admitted. "Not anymore." Chapter 9. 3 days after the ball, Jeffrey asked her again. Properly this time, in the privacy of Bartley House's garden where jasmine bloomed and no audience watched. "Georgia." He took both her hands, his touch gentle but steady. "I need you to know that you have a choice. Complete freedom. The scandal is contained. Cordelia has fled to the continent, and you could walk away right now with your reputation intact and financial security assured. No one would blame you." "Jeffrey." "Let me finish." His eyes held hers with fierce tenderness. "I'm not asking you to marry me because of any arrangement or obligation or convenient solution. I'm asking because I love you. Because I want to spend my life arguing about philosophy and laughing at terrible plays and building something real with you. But only if you want that too. Only if you're choosing me, not circumstance." Georgia felt tears prickling behind her eyes. "I choose you. Not your title, not your fortune, not the security you represent. Just you, the man who reads until 3 in the morning and cares about tenant cottages and looks at me like I'm the most fascinating thing he's ever discovered." She squeezed his hands. "I choose us. I choose to be brave enough to need someone. I choose love over safety. Even though it's terrifying. Especially because it's terrifying." She smiled through her tears. "The best things usually are." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, like a promise rather than a performance. The wedding preparations were chaos of the best kind. Natalie threw herself into planning with characteristic enthusiasm, though she'd learned to actually ask their opinions rather than dictate. Aunt Beatrice wept happy tears while helping Georgia choose her gown. Cream silk with delicate lace, elegant without ostentation. Even Jeffrey's usually reserved steward was caught smiling at the obvious joy radiating from the Duke. The ceremony itself was intimate, held in the small chapel on the Thornwick estate. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting rainbows across the ancient stone. Georgia's hands trembled as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality of choosing this, choosing him, choosing a future built on truth rather than necessity. Jeffrey waited at the altar, looking simultaneously terrified and certain. When she reached him, he whispered, "Still time to run." "Not a chance," she whispered back. They'd written their own vows. Jeffrey's voice was steady but raw with emotion. "I promise to see you, not just what you provide. To value your mind as much as your heart. To be your partner in all things, not your protector or provider, but your equal. I promise to choose you every day, Even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. Georgia's turn. I promise to trust you with my fears and my strength. To let myself need you without losing myself. To challenge you and support you and build something real with you. I promise to be brave enough to love you today and always. This is the scariest thing I've ever done, Jeffrey murmured as the vicar pronounced them married. And the best, Georgia replied. Their kiss was witnessed by 50 guests, but it felt like they were the only two people in existence. That night, alone in their chambers with the formalities finally complete, Georgia found herself nervous in an entirely different way. Jeffrey sensed it immediately. We don't have to. I want to. She met his eyes. No more holding back. No more self-protection. I want all of it. The vulnerability, the intimacy, everything. Are you certain? I've never been more certain of anything. She reached for him. Make love to me, Jeffrey. Not the Duke. Just you. What followed was tender and awkward and utterly genuine. Two people learning each other without pretense, choosing vulnerability over armor, passion over safety. When Jeffrey's hands trembled unbuttoning her gown, Georgia covered them with her own. When she hesitated at her own inexperience, he kissed her fears away with patient tenderness. I love you, he whispered against her skin. Every stubborn, brilliant, beautiful part of you. I love you, she breathed back. All your hidden softness beneath that ducal frost. Afterwards, wrapped in each other's arms as moonlight spilled across the bed, Georgia finally understood what it meant to be chosen. Not for utility or convenience, but for herself. And to choose in return freely and completely. No regrets. Jeffrey asked quietly, his fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. Not a single one. She pressed closer, feeling his steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. This is real. Finally, genuinely real. Finally, he agreed, and in his voice she heard the same wonder she felt, that something born from deception could transform into the most honest thing either of them had ever known. Outside their window, the world continued on. But here, in the sanctuary they'd created together, two wounded people had chosen to risk everything on love, and discovered that sometimes the greatest courage is simply letting someone in. Epilogue. Bartley House had never been designed for the chaos of children, but somehow it had adapted beautifully. Georgia stood in the doorway of the morning room, watching 3-year-old Thomas attempt to teach his 1-year-old sister Eleanor the finer points of block tower construction. A lesson that mostly involved Eleanor gleefully demolishing whatever Thomas built, then laughing at her brother's theatrical despair. Papa says you're destroying my architectural vision, Thomas informed his sister with impressive gravity for someone barely out of leading strings. Eleanor responded by shoving another block in her mouth. Your son is definitely yours, Georgia said as Jeffrey appeared beside her, sliding an arm around her waist with the casual affection that still made her heart flutter 5 years into their marriage. That's pure ducal pomposity. My son. Jeffrey's eyes gleamed with humor. I believe the stubbornness comes entirely from his mother's side. Mama. Papa. Thomas spotted them and abandoned his architectural dreams to launch himself at Jeffrey's legs. Eleanor is being destructive again. Jeffrey scooped up his son with practiced ease. She's won, Thomas. Destruction is rather her primary skill at the moment. Like Aunt Natalie, Thomas said seriously, making Georgia choke on her laughter. Speaking of whom, Natalie's voice announced from the doorway. I heard that, you precocious child, and I'll have you know I'm only constructively destructive these days. She swept in, resplendent in lavender silk, and immediately claimed Eleanor from her nurse. Besides, without my destructive tendencies, none of you would be here. Here we go, Jeffrey muttered. I maintain, Natalie said, settling onto the settee with Eleanor in her lap, that I orchestrated this entire situation brilliantly. If not for my intervention at that garden party. You introduced us, Jeffrey interrupted with the patience of long practice. We did the rest. I created the perfect conditions for love to flourish, Natalie insisted. You created chaos, Georgia corrected. But her tone was affectionate. She crossed to sit beside Natalie, pressing a kiss to Eleanor's dark curls. But you know, sometimes the best things do start with good intentions and chaos. I won't deny that. Natalie beamed. See, Georgia appreciates my genius. I appreciate your meddling having worked out, Georgia said. This time. Please don't make it a habit. After luncheon, with the children down for their naps and Natalie departed to terrorize some other corner of London society, Georgia and Jeffrey found themselves in the garden. The same garden where Natalie had first approached her 5 years ago, where everything had begun with desperate lies and financial necessity. The jasmine still bloomed. The fountain still splashed. But everything else had transformed. Do you ever think about it? Georgia asked, her hand in Jeffrey's as they walked the familiar paths. How close we came to walking away from this. Frequently. His grip tightened. I think about that night I almost let you leave. About how fear nearly cost me everything that matters. We were both so terrified. She stopped by the fountain, the same spot where he'd confessed feelings she'd been too afraid to accept. Of needing anyone, of being hurt again, of building something on a foundation that started with deception. And now, he turned to face her, his free hand cupping her cheek. Now I know that where something starts matters less than where it grows. She leaned into his touch. We started with lies, Jeffrey. But we built something true. Still pretending? He asked softly, echoing a question from years ago. Not for a single moment. Georgia smiled. This is the most real thing I've ever known. You, our children, this life we've created. It's all genuinely, terrifyingly, wonderfully real. Even when Thomas decides to reorganize my library by color instead of subject? Especially then. She laughed. Though you might want to have words with him about that. Jeffrey pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers. Thank you. For what? For being brave enough to stay. For choosing me when you had every reason to run. His voice dropped. For loving me despite everything. You make it easy, she whispered. Even when you're impossibly stubborn and ducal. I learned from the best. Thomas's voice drifted from an upstairs window. Eleanor, no. That's not food. Followed by Eleanor's delighted shriek and a crash that suggested something breakable had met its doom. Duty calls, Jeffrey said with resignation. But his eyes were warm with affection. Welcome to real life, Georgia replied, taking his hand as they headed back toward the house, toward their chaotic, genuine, imperfect family. And as they walked past the spot where a desperate sister had once whispered a mad proposition to a stranger, Georgia felt gratitude wash over her. For Natalie's meddling, for Lady Cordelia's unwitting role in forcing them together, for every terrifying moment that had led to this. Sometimes the best love stories began with the worst possible circumstances. Sometimes deception could transform into devotion. Sometimes two wounded people could choose each other and build something lasting from the most unlikely foundation. She looked at Jeffrey, saw him watching their children through the window with unguarded love, and knew with absolute certainty. This was worth every risk they'd taken. This was home.